Are we live?
Oh, wait, hold on 1 second. I thought Terry might have took the hotspot.
It
Maybe
say
wait.
live.
It say live. You know, time popping up though. Okay, there we go. Yeah, okay, there we go.
Okay, we're live. We're reading Assata, the very end of just about day 4. Um, Not ironically, but interestingly enough, on the anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King, we are reading a book about Assata Shakur, whose life and early early adulthood, early revolutionary life was very much impacted by the assassination of Dr. King. She even mentioned it several times in the book already. So we're on page 219. I'm going to pick up where Leslie left off here. Okay, I have always hated to get up early, get up in the morning. And the sheer idea of getting up early, getting up every day at 4:30 made me groan. But I thought about the children I let down. Getting up early should be an easy thing for a revolutionary. Okay, I'm gonna skip down because I know I remember hearing Leslie read that part. Okay, making breakfast for a whole bunch of hungry kids in the morning is not an easy task, especially when you don't know how many are coming or how many they're going to much they're going to eat. There was one little boy who I was convinced had a tapeworm. He put away so much food it was unbelievable. One day I saw him stuff some food into his pockets. Would you like some paper to wrap that in? I asked him, tearing off a piece of foil. I wasn't stealing. Tears welled up in his eyes. Of course you weren't. Everything is free here and you can take as much as you want. But don't you want to wrap it up so your pockets don't get all greasy? It's for my mother. We don't have no food and the store is broke. The stove is broke. You can tell your mother that she can come down if she wants, to. And you can take as much food home as you want to. A few of the other kids were looking at us. That goes for everyone. If you want to take a sandwich or something with you, just let me know and I'll give you some wrapping paper for it. After that, I would try to remember to ask if anybody wanted anything to go. Most of the kids were interested. Give me an egg sandwich to go. I want 2 sausages to go. We rarely met the parents. When a new kid joined the program, the parents might drop by to check it out, but in general, they would only come to leave the kids or pick them up. The breakfast program in East Harlem was the poorest. In the middle of winter, some of the kids were without hats, gloves, scarves, and boots, and wore just some skimpy coats or jackets. When it was possible, we tried to hook them up with something from the free clothing drive. Only once in a while, when everything went smoothly and we were through early, did we get a chance to spend some time with the children. Usually we were in a rush, making sure they got out to school on time. Some of the Panthers wanted them to learn the 10-point program and platform, and others wanted to teach them Panther songs. I preferred talking to them, sitting down with them, and exchanging ideas. So we just sort of combined these approaches. We were all dead set against cramming things in their heads or teaching them meaningless rote phrases. The children were so naturally curious we had to take care not to let the food burn while we answered their questions. My closest friends in the party were Daruba, Ketawayo, and Jamal. They were all out on bail from the Panther 21 case. They came over to my house and we sat for hours talking politics, the party, North Korea, and what was happening on 116th Street. I learned more in one night than I learned in City College in a month. They had a hard time dealing with me, though. I can be stubborn as 6 mules and will argue anyone down until I'm convinced one way or the other. Although I no longer hated white people and no longer saw all of them as the enemy, I was still not too fond of them. As far as I was concerned, it was the duty of black people to work in the black community, and it was the job of white people to go into the white community and organize white people. The brothers were in 100% agreement with that. We also agreed that it was necessary for black, white, Hispanic, Native American, and Oriental people to come together to fight. We disagreed on who and what I should study. Usually, after a disagreement, they suggested I read this or that, often Marx, Lenin, or Engels. I prefer Ho Chi Minh, Kim II, Song, Che, or Fidel, but I ended up having to get into Marx and Lenin just to understand a lot of the speeches and stuff Huey Newton was putting out. It wasn't easy reading, but I was glad I did it. It opened up my horizons a hell of a lot. I didn't relate to them as the great white fathers or like some kind of gods like some of the white revolutionaries did. As far as I was concerned, they were two dudes who had made contributions to revolutionary struggle too great to be ignored. The more I studied, the more critical I became of the political education PE program in the party. There were 3 different political education classes: community classes, classes for BPP cadre, and PE classes, or political education classes, for Panther leadership. In the community classes, Panthers explained the 10-point program and the general objectives and philosophy of the Black Panther Party, as well as various articles that appeared in the Black Panther newspaper. As far as I was concerned, these were the best PE classes the party ever gave. If the teachers were good, the classes were interesting and fun. With a few exceptions, PE classes for party members turned out to be just the opposite. We reviewed articles in the BPP paper, read passages from Miles' Red Book, and discussed certain speeches and articles by various party members. Most of the time, whoever was given the class discussed whatever we were studying and explained it, but without giving the underlying issues or putting it into any historical context. The basic program was not whether the teacher was good or bad. The basic problem was not whether the teacher was good or bad. The basic problem stemmed from the fact that the BPP had no systematic approach to political education. They were reading the Red Book, but didn't know who Harriet Tubman, Marcus Garvey, and Nat Turner were. They talked about intercommunalism, but still really believed that the Civil War was fought to free the slaves. A whole lot of them barely understood any kind of history, black, African, or otherwise. Huey Newton had written that politics was war without bloodshed, and that war was politics with bloodshed. To a lot of Panthers, however, struggle consisted of only 2 aspects: picking up gun and serving the people. That was the main reason many party members, in my opinion, underestimated the need to unite with other black organizations and to struggle around various community issues. A lot of the sisters and brothers had joined because they were sick and tired of the oppression they had been suffering. Most of them had never been in the struggle before. Quite a few joined thinking the party was going to issue them a gun and direct them to go out and shoot pigs. Most of these brothers and sisters had attended inferior schools which either taught them lies or nothing at all. Education of every kind was sorely needed. Without an adequate education program, many Panthers fell into a Roboton bag. They repeated slogans and phrases without understanding their complete meaning, often resulting in dogmatic and short-sighted practices. For example, one day an African brother who was working with one of the African liberation movements came into the office and gave us a beautiful calendar put out by one of the African liberation groups. It was bad. It had beautiful pictures of African freedom fighters and said something like international support for African liberation. The first thing I did was hang it up. When I came to the office the next day, the calendar was gone. When I asked what had happened to it, they said the calendar said international, and we're not internationalists. We're intercommunalists. I am convinced that a systematic program for political education, ranging from the simplest to the highest level, is imperative for any successful organization or movement for black liberation in this country. And just from my personal perspective, the case for the need for political education or historical education amongst the leadership in Rockford, whether it be grassroots political or social leadership, the clergy or whatever, especially those that are engaged in working with the community and try to address community issues. The education and the international perspective is something that that's why I'm glad that this is being done here, so that we can try to work to establish some type of common core of information and knowledge. So it's interesting that she saw that in some of the young Black Panthers. I am convinced that a systematic program for political education, ranging from the simplest to the highest level, is imperative for any successful organization or movement for black liberation in this country. The party had some of the most politically conscious sisters and brothers as members, but in some ways it failed to spread the consciousness to the cadre in general. I also thought it was a real shame the BPP didn't teach Panthers organizing and mobilizing techniques. Some members were natural geniuses at organizing people, but they were usually the busiest comrades with the most responsibility. Part of the problem was that the party had grown so fast that there wasn't a lot of time to come up with step-by-step approaches to things. The other part of the problem was that almost from its inception, the BPP was under attack from the U.S. government. At first, I didn't feel the repression too deeply. I knew the party was under attack, but it felt like it wasn't so near, like it was lingering in the background. What made me mad was the media treatment of the BPP, which gave the impression that the party was racist and violent, and it worked. The pigs would burst into a Panther office, shoot first, and ask questions later. The press always reported that the police had uncovered a large arsenal of weapons. Later, when the arsenal turned out to be a few legally registered rifles and shotguns, the press never printed a word. The same thing goes on today. Nobody gets upset about white people having guns, but let a black person have a gun and something criminal is going on. The only time white America is in favor of black people having guns is when we are using them to do America's dirty work. They've got a lot of black people so scared they are scared even to think about owning a gun. But the way the tide of racism is rising in this country, black people better be more scared to not have a gun than to have one. And it's interesting that that's the climate now. I believe gun ownership, well, amongst all people, but gun ownership and gun club membership, I think there's even now some black gun clubs. I'm pretty sure that there's always been, but even more popping up. And so things go full circle, come around full circle. Guess they say it's nothing new under the sun, but we're seeing that this type of climate that was prevailing in the 60s and 70s seems to be coming again, or the potential for that type of mass consciousness. The potential is there. And hopefully we can read these books from authors and witnesses and people that were around in the 60s and 70s, and we can learn from the mistakes and we can learn from the successes. and we don't have to repeat some of those things. Like I said, I could see that in the 60s consciousness was raising, and it came into almost full bloom in the 70s. You could see the sort of pro-black, the black is beautiful, proud to be black. There people were wearing afros and things like that, but it's hard to figure out how deep that consciousness was, because then in the 80s a lot of those symbols disappeared. We went from the afro to the jerry curl within, I believe, a decade. So hopefully we can learn by reading these books that are written about or by people that could bear witness to the things that were happening in the 60s and 70s, and learn to even take our consciousness level deeper than was, say, in the 60s and 70s, so that a decade or something like the crack epidemic or whatever it may be, we will be able to withstand some of those things, those roadblocks, those stumbling blocks. So again, we're reading Assata. We're reading Assata, an autobiography. We're almost done with the book. I'm reading from page 223. Black people better be more scared to not have a gun than to have one. With the Ku Klux Klan and all these other races running around, black people have got to be suicidal if they don't own and know how to operate a gun. If you don't own a gun now, you better rush out and buy one, because in a few years, the way this country is moving, it might be against the law for blacks to buy guns. One of the best things about struggling is the people you meet. Before I became involved, I never dreamed such beautiful people existed. Of course, there were some creeps, but I can't say without the slightest hesitation that I have been blessed with meeting some of the kindest, most courageous, most principled, most informed, and intelligent people on the face of the earth. And I would say that too, from my vantage point and the experience that I had over the summer. It's being called a lot of things from May 30th, 2020, really into now, or up, through the summer and fall. I encountered and was blessed to meet some of the most intelligent young people that I've encountered and met, and that's one of the things. That's why, I like to say that freedom movement. A freedom movement is happening in Rockford, or we experienced some of that in the summer, and that those that participated definitely learned something or became more informed about certain issues that they may not have been informed of, and that in of itself is a reason for people that may not agree with everything that is said, or what that is going on, or the philosophy, the ideology of everyone around. Is definitely a learning experience. It's transformative to be in revolutionary environments. Okay. Okay, if there's such a thing as luck, I've had an abundance of it. And the ones who have brought it to me are my friends and comrades, my wild, big-hearted friends with their pretty ways and pretty thoughts have given me more happiness than I will ever deserve. There was never a time, no matter what horrible thing I was undergoing, when I felt completely alone. Maybe it's ironic, I don't know, but the one thing I do know is that the Black Liberation Movement has done more for me than I will ever be able to do for it. Becoming Zaid's friend was something really important. After I joined the party, he would drop by my house every so often. We would listen to music and talk politics. I was forever teasing him about being part of the leadership. He was the minister of information. Since he was the only leader up at the Bronx ministry, with the exception of Afina Secure, I had I had any respect for that I had any respect for. He would laugh at my Robert Bay jokes, but he never once said a disparaging word about any of the other comrades. I also respected him because he refused to become part of the macho cult that was an official body in the BPP. He never voted on issues or took a position just to be one of the boys. When brothers made an unprincipled attack on sisters, Zaid refused to participate. Whenever we hooked up for a meeting at somebody's house, he was the first to volunteer to cook dinner, or if dinner was already cooked, the first to roll up his sleeves and wash the dishes. I knew this had to be especially hard for him because he was small and his masculinity was always being challenged in some way by the more backward, muscle-headed men in the party. Zaid always treated me and all the other sisters with respect. I enjoyed his friendship because he was one of those rare men completely capable of being friends with a woman without having designs on her. We communicated on such an intense, honest level that afterward I wondered if it had been real. And he was cultured. When you say cultured, most people think you're talking about the opera and Amy Vanderbilt's etiquette book. But that's not what I'm talking about. He was well versed and well educated about every aspect of black life. He could not only recite Langston Hughes by heart and give a biographical rundown of Coltrane, Betsy Smith, or James Cleveland, but he could also sit down and have an intelligent conversation about dream books or Argo starch eaters. After a while, Zaid asked me to work with him on party projects. It was mostly dealing with white support groups who were involved in raising bail for the Panther 21 members still in jail. I hated it. At the time, I felt that anything below 110th Street was another country. All my activities were centered in Harlem, and I almost never left it. Doing defense committee work, we definitely not up. Oh, okay. Doing defense committee work was definitely not up my alley. I think that was one of the reasons Zayed insisted on bringing me to some of these events, and that he knew how much I hated them. I was the perfect angry panther. I hated standing around while all these white people asked me to explain myself, my existence. I became a master of the one-line answer. What made you become a panther? Oppression. What do you think about Huey Newton? He's a right-on black revolutionary leader. What do you think white people should be doing? Organizing other white people in their communities, supporting black and third world liberation struggles, and helping to free the Panther 21. Once a guy asked if I was really going to off the pigs. Not tonight. I couldn't get over how personal some of those people tried to get even, though I'd never seen them before. One came over to me and asked Zayed if Zayed was a Panther husband. When I looked at her as if she was crazy for asking me a question like that, she said, giggling all over herself, I mean, is he your cat? Another woman came over and stuck her hands all in my hair. Oh, I just had to touch your hair. It's so kinky. Zayed would be steady trying to convince the defense groups to raise more money. He explained how important it was to have the Panther 21 out on the street, organizing and educating people about what was going on in America. Zayed was polite and understanding and patient. After he gave his little speech, he would turn to me and ask, what do you think about that, sister? Rapping in my best Panther cadence, I would say something like, black people have been oppressed for 400 years. We are still being oppressed. The Panther 21 don't need any moral support. They need concrete support. They don't want to hear that you sympathize with them. They want to hear that you are willing and ready to help liberate them. When we were finished, a second donation would be given. Zaid was usually cool and poised at these functions, except once. We were at a meeting with the computer people for peace, a group that was helping to raise the money to bail out Sundiata Acoli. Sundiata Acoli. Zayed said Sundiata should be the next Panther to be bailed out because his leadership qualities were sorely needed in the party. One guy kept interrupting him, implying that Zayed was pushing for Sundiata's release because they were friends, that he was being subjective and dealing from an emotional rather than a scientific, objective analysis. Zayed's face underwent a complete change. I could see that he was trying to control himself to keep from going off on this dude. What do you mean? I'm being subjective. Don't you ever open your mouth to me to tell me I'm being subjective as long as you live. My brother Lumumba, my own flesh and blood, has also been locked up for more than a year, and I haven't asked you for a dime to bail him out. Lumumba Shakur was one of the Panther 21. A complete hush came over the room. The computer people said they would do everything they could to raise money for Sundiata's bail, and that's what they did. The only thing was that once that $100,000 cash bail was raised, Pig Judge Murtagh refused to release him or any of the others. We were furious and helpless. After a while, everything seemed strange to me. I was catching all these weird vibrations and sensations. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I could sense a whole lot of stuff was going on. I felt like I was standing on top of a river with currents swirling down underneath the surface. All these strange things were starting to happen. I would go to the laundromat and find a black policeman there who said he wanted to join the party. Every once in a while, I'd turn around and see strange men following me. Even though I had no money to pay any telephone bill and had long stopped paying it, the telephone kept working, and after a while, I stopped receiving my bills. Politically, I was not at all happy with the direction of the party. Huey went on a nationwide tour advocating his own theory of intercommunality. The essence of the theory was that imperialism had reached such a degree that sovereign borders were no longer recognized and that oppressed nations no longer existed, only oppressed communities, within and outside the U.S. The problem was that somebody had gotten to tell these oppressed communities that they were no longer nations. Even worse, almost no one understood Huey's long speeches explaining intercommunalism. Huey Newton was not what you would call a good speaker. In fact, he had a kind of high-pitched, monotonous voice, and his rambling for 3 hours about the negation of the negation was sheer disaster. People walked out in droves. Instead of criticizing what was happening, most of the party members defended it. When I said that Huey needed speaking lessons, they jumped down my throat. When Huey changed his title from defense minister to the ridiculous-sounding supreme commander, and then to the even more ridiculous supreme servant, damn near nobody said a word. That was one of the big problems in the party. Criticism and self-criticism were not encouraged, and the little that was given often was not taken seriously. Constructive criticism and self-criticism are extremely important for any revolutionary organization. Without them, people tend to drown in their mistakes, not learn from them. Again, we're reading from Assata. These are her words or her thoughts. I don't know that I would totally disagree or agree with her critique, but she was there. She can bear witness to her own experiences. Because I was still a college student, I was often called on by the BPP to do student work. I didn't mind working with students to coordinate this or that, but I was deathly afraid of speaking in public. But they insisted I had to learn in order to be effective on campus. I had an old rickety tape recorder that was on its last legs. I decided to use it to practice public speaking. On and on I went, blah, 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 into the microphone. The telephone rang. I put the mic down, turned off the recorder, and rushed to the phone. Hello, Joanne. Stop making tapes, the voice said. The phone clicked. I stood there with the receiver in my hand. I had to get out of there. I ran to get my coat. I needed some privacy to think. Every day at the office, things were getting stranger and stranger. Rumors that the pigs were going to attack the office were rampant. Convinced of the invasion, the leadership decided to secure the office. The big storefront window was removed and replaced by a wooden partition. Windows without glass were cut into wood, covered by little wooden doors. What are all those little holes for, I asked. To shoot out of, they told me. Piles of sandbags were brought into the office. I didn't believe that shit. Everybody was talking about defending the office. Why do we have to defend the office, I asked. They told me something about Executive Mandate number 3. It said Panthers were supposed to defend the office against pig attacks. I was all in favor of self-defense, but I couldn't see giving my life up just to defend the office. It's the principle of the thing, they told me. I didn't understand what principle they were talking about. One of the basic laws of people's struggle was to retreat when the enemy is strong and to attack when the enemy is weak. As far as I was concerned, defending the office was suicidal. The pigs had manpower, initiative, surprise, and gunpowder. We would just be sitting ducks. I felt that the party was dealing from an emotional rather than a rational basis. Just because you believe in self-defense doesn't mean you let yourself be sucked into defending yourself on the enemy's terms. One of the party's major weaknesses, I thought, was the failure to clearly differentiate between above-ground political struggle and underground clandestine military struggle. An above-ground political organization could wage guerrilla war anymore. An above-ground political organization can't wage guerrilla war any more than an underground army can do above-ground political work. Although the two must work together, they must have completely separate structures, and any links between the two must remain secret. Educating the people about the necessity for self-defense and for armed struggle was one thing, but maintaining a policy of defending party offices against insurmountable odds was another. Of course, if the police just came in and started shooting, defending yourself made sense. But the point is to try and prevent that from happening. One day, in the not-too-distant future, any black organization that is not based on bootlicking and timing will be forced underground. And as fast as this country is moving to the fascist far right, black revolutionary organizations should start preparing for the inevitability. Fascist governments do not permit revolutionary or progressive opposition groups to exist, no matter how peaceful or nonviolent they are. It doesn't matter whether the fascist government simply outlaws the groups like in Nazi Germany or mounts a counterintelligence campaign to destroy opposition groups like in the U.S. It was growing more and more impossible to get work done. Everything seemed to be in a continuous state of chaos. the party decided at once to open a Saturday liberation school for children, and I was assigned to the project. I was really ecstatic about it because I love working with children, and I was really tired of adults at that time. Being my usual reserved self, I threw every bit of energy I had into the project. I collected books, materials, paints, photographs, children's Black history stories, children's records, etc. Two other comrades were assigned to the project. Everybody pitched in, and after a few weeks, we had a whole pile of children attending. Just as we got the program on its feet, I was called aside and taken into confidence. The party had information that the pigs were going to raid the office in about 2 weeks. If the pigs were going to attack the office, why would they bother to tell us? I asked. We have our sources, sister, I was told. Just like the pigs have their sources, we have ours. I was skeptical, but I figured they knew more about it than I did. In preparation for the coming attack, I was asked to prepare a child care place, a safe house for Panther children. It sounded kind of wild, but I agreed to do it. In the back of my mind, I half thought they were testing me to see how I would respond in a crisis. I put the child care thing together. 2 weeks came and went, but there was no invasion. In addition, a lot of things were going on that I was too happy about. Plans, priorities, and procedures changed daily, and most of the time the changes were ill-conceived. Everything had an arbitrary air to it, and I certainly did not have the feeling that we were waging a step-by-step analytical struggle. There was little internal conflict in either the Harlem branch or the New York chapter. For the most part, Panthers were a friendly, open group of people who really went out of their way to be kind and helpful, and in spite of all the pressure and hardships they had to deal with, managed to be principled and to fight as hard as they knew how for our people. We had a bit of a leadership problem with Robert Bay and Jolly, who were both from the West Coast. Bay's problem was that he was none too bright and that he had an aggressive, even belligerent way of talking and dealing with people. Jolly's problem was that he was Robert Bay's shadow. Bay later became Huey Newton's bodyguard, a job for which he was much more suited. Cotton had come to Harlem from California. Everybody loved him. He was everybody's main man. He had known Bunchy Carter, Little Bobby Hutton, and Chief David Hillier. And of course, the Rage, Eldridge Cleaver. Cotton had been sent to New York and put in charge of fixing up the brownstone the party had bought on 127th Street. According to the grapevine, Huey wanted to move BPP headquarters to New York, and Cotton was to prepare the security for the house. He used to mosey over to the Harlem office with a bottle of cheap pluck in his back pocket and tell war stories. He would sip his wine and talk about what had gone down on the coast. The first time I went over to inspect the 127th Street house, Cotton gave me a guided tour. He explained a whole futuristic security plan. He was going to hook up the security system so that if so much as a foot was put on the front steps of the building, an alarm would alert the security office inside. If it was the pigs, huge floodlights would be turned on, blinding them. Thick metal doors would glide into place, and a lot of other fantastic things would happen that I don't remember. I kept my mouth shut because I knew absolutely nothing about security, but I silently wondered why he didn't put in stuff that was more conventional, like a closed-circuit TV. I had a special interest in the building since the ground floor and the basement were designated to be the free health clinic. At the time, the basement was a disaster, with no plumbing, no heat, no electricity, and a mountain load of bricks, powder, and debris. Cotton assured me that the basement would be fixed up within 6 months. Some of this sounds a bit like internal information, but maybe she has a good reason for telling this aspect. Because sometimes when you talk about weaknesses in organizations or bad experiences you had with in so-called activist circles or within protest movements or protest activities, those that would like to see those movements or those activities fail love to hear about internal conflict or love to hear about bad experiences or love to, of course you have to, if you're telling a story, you want to tell all sides and give as much information that makes the story understandable. But sometimes I don't think it's a good idea to share negative information about your experiences working and revolutionary organizations or working for revolutionary aims. Okay. Next, he showed me Huey's room. It was the only room in the house somewhat fixed up. He had put up wooden paneling. There was a small table and a single bed, which he carefully explained to me was made up in military style, ready at all times for the minister. I looked at him like he was crazy. Of all the things I could imagine Huey doing, sleeping in that freezing house on that Spartan bed was not one of them. Cotton talked about Huey with this eerie reverence that made me sick, and it sounded sure enough weird how Cotton talked about the minister's bed. I visited the house on 127th Street many times over the next few months. Hard as I tried, I could not find one shred of progress. I came to the conclusion that Cotton was a big mouth and a drunk. But everybody kept telling me how hard he was working. So I figured he was working on something secret that they had obviously decided not to tell me about. During one of my trips to the house, Cotton's assistant told me he didn't feel well. I made an appointment with the doctor and called to tell him the time. A few days later, when I came into the office, everyone looked at me like I had committed some crime against the people. What's wrong? I asked. Cotton says that the brother who works for him is sick and that you refuse to do anything for him. What? I was completely surprised. That's not true. Cotton says that's what's happened. Fired up mad, I tried to get Cotton on the phone, but it was out of order. It took me several days to get the thing straight. But finally the assistant confirmed that I had made the doctor's appointment for him, but that he had neglected to keep it and had gone home instead. I tried to figure out why Cotton had made such a fuss. The only conclusion I could come to is that he was annoyed. Annoyed with me because I kept pushing him to get the clinic in order. Several years later, after the Freedom of Information Act was passed, it was revealed that Cotton had been working undercover for the police. Things seemed to be going from bad to worse. Although there wasn't much dissension in the New York branch, there was dissension and disunity on the national level. Every other weekend, somebody was going out to the West Coast to deal with contradictions. Quote, contradictions. Everybody was uptight and miserable. And then everything started to happen at once. First, there was an article stating that Huey was living in a $650 a month apartment in Oakland. The Harlem branch was shocked because in those days, that was a whole lot of rent, and it contrasted sharply with the living conditions of the Panthers in New York. Panthers who owned little more than the clothes on their backs were out in the street in the freezing cold weather selling pans, with big pieces of cardboard in their shoes, with flimsy jackets, and did nothing to hold back the hawk. That did nothing to hold back the hawk. The party issued a statement that Huey was living in an apartment for security purposes, but a lot of Panthers were not at all convinced. Rain is coming down pretty good. Make sure all the equipment is secure. Again, we're reading Assata. These are all her words. It's talking about her experience working with the Black Panther Party, the New York chapter, which, as we talked about early, the top leadership of the Black Panther Party in New York was removed at one point, and as we suspected earlier, the void that was left was filled with COINTELPRO agents, basically. And so when you look at the behavior of what you call agent provocateurs or COINTELPRO police, a lot of times they'll come with that super revolutionary, as if they're the top, that they're ready to off pigs, or they talk a whole lot of aggressive stuff. A lot of times that we used to take that as a sign that a person was kind of suspect, and that was the case with that person that she described. But let me see, should we try to secure this? Is it good in the rain, or is okay?
Just a little bit of blowing
Okay.
in. We're gonna get any place better.
Many long-standing loyal Panthers were being expelled by Huey. One of the first to go in Huey's private purge was Geronimo Elmer Pratt. Geronimo was widely respected, somewhat of a Panther folk hero. When I heard about it, the first thing I did was go to someone who would know and try to find out the real deal. Although paranoid and upset, the person broke down the story to me just enough to let me know the expulsion was probably unjust. I couldn't imagine Geronimo being an enemy of the people, any more than I could imagine myself being one. Then came the expulsions of the Panther 21, supposedly for writing an open letter to the weathermen that was somewhat critical of BPP policies. I had read the letter and could find nothing in it to merit such extreme action, especially since it might prove prejudicial to their ongoing trial. I was becoming more and more critical of what was going on in the party. But I loved it nevertheless and wanted to see it functioning on the right track. For the first time, I questioned whether I could continue within the party. Almost every project I was working on was frustrated and barely able to get off the ground. The Saturday Liberation School, the free health clinic, and I think as Leslie was talking earlier, and as many people that have been involved in liberation struggles will tell you, there sometimes revolutionary struggle or revolutionary leadership. And when I say revolutionary, personally, I'm talking about complete change. That's what when I say revolution, I'm talking about complete change. And so a lot of times when people talk about those experiences, some people take that information and get discouraged and they will not participate in with what people would consider activists or change organizations, because they hear stories of infighting, or some of the frustrations that come with it, some of the failures, or like as Leslie was talking about, when you put on an event and no one shows up, or you try to do something and the people aren't responsive. Those things shouldn't discourage you, And so as I'm reading this, sometimes it can be kind of depressing, for me at least, to hear how organizations that we held to high esteem, or we saw as flawless, or we may have romanticized, or we're not able to look at objectively, when we hear some of the the internal conflict, whether you study the civil rights movement, whether you study the Mau Mau revolution in Kenya, whether you study the ANC or the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, even between Winnie Mandela and Nelson Mandela, the sort of differences in ideology between those two were used to wedge large conflict amongst people. And when some people, when they see conflict or they hear stories about things not going perfectly, they get discouraged. And that shouldn't happen. Working for change is not an easy thing, and it's something where there are going to be setbacks. It's not easy, and it shouldn't be romanticized. And so Assata is giving her account of what it was like to work as a woman. That's one of the vantage points she's coming from, to working as a woman in the Black Panther office in New York. Okay. This party was a lot different from the Black Panther Party I had fallen in love with. Gone were the black berets and leather jackets because of police harassment. Panthers had been ordered not to wear the uniform except for special occasions. Gone were the Panther marches, the Panther songs. Gone were the Free Huey, Free Bobby sung to the tune of Wade in the Water. Gone were the Big Panther buttons and the Big Panther flags flapping in the wind. Everything felt different. The easy, friendly openness had been replaced by fear and paranoia. The beautiful revolutionary creativity I had loved so much was gone and replaced by dogmatic stagnation. It was around this time that Zayed and I had our big falling out. I had made a list of the criticisms of the party, along with a list of things I thought were positive and a lot of suggestions I thought might correct some of the problems the party was facing. I called Zayed and told him I needed to talk to him. When he arrived, I bared my heart and soul to him. I must have talked for a good 2 or 3 hours, raising all of the political and tactical concerns I had. Zayed listened and everything I said without taking any position one way or the other. Then he told me he had to leave and would talk to me another time. I was furious. I felt he was acting in his role as leadership and using our friendship to gain information about how I thought, to gauge the level of dissension within the ranks. Throughout my days in the party, I've always been outspoken and blunt. Zayed and I had always been frank with each other, and I interrupted his silence, and I interpreted his silence as a declaration that he supported and defended policies I considered unprincipled and politically incorrect. After that, we didn't see or speak to each other for a long time. I had no way of knowing the thin tightrope he was walking or the pressure he was under. Zayed was acting as peacemaker between Huey and the Panther 21, furiously trying to get Huey to rescind his expulsion order. Zayed felt that to take any position in reference to problems within the party might jeopardize his role and result in dire consequences for the Panther 21. Ketawayo and Daruba, who had not been expelled because they were out on bail and had not signed the letter, were also attempting to get the Panther 21 reinstated. They were under a lot of pressure from both sides. Huey wanted them to support the expulsion, and the expelled Panthers wanted them to criticize Huey's actions. Like Zayed, Set, and Daruba honestly believed they could straighten out the madness. And were it not for the FBI, they probably could have. Nobody back then had ever heard of the counterintelligence program COINTELPRO. set up by the FBI. Nobody could possibly have known that the FBI had sent a phony letter to Eldridge Cleaver in Algiers, signed by the Panther 21, criticizing Huey Newton's leadership. No one could have known that the FBI had sent a letter to Huey's brother saying the New York Panthers were plotting to kill him. No one could have known that the FBI's COINTELPRO was attempting to destroy the Black Panther Party in particular and the Black Liberation Movement in general, using divide and conquer tactics. The FBI's COINTELPRO program consisted of turning members of organizations against each other, pitting one black organization against another. Huey ended up suspending Set and Dhoruba from the party, branded them as enemies of the people, and caused them to go into hiding in fear for their lives. No one had the slightest idea that this whole scenario was carefully manipulated and orchestrated by the FBI. When they brought the Black Panther newspaper to the office, the one that branded Dhoruba, Set, and Set's wife, Connie Matthews Tabor, as enemies of the people, I refused to sell it and attacked it on its outright lie, as an outright lie. I had been so outspoken about my criticisms that I knew it was just a matter of time before I, too, would be expelled. Sick and disgusted, I decided it was time for me to leave the party. Most of the Panthers understood why I left, and I stayed on good terms with them. They would call me and ask if they could drop by or sleep over at my crib. Almost daily, I got a blow-by-blow description of what was going on in the party. The tension had increased even more, the differences between the New York cadre and the West Coast leadership growing even wider. I tried to stress to the comrades what I saw to be the importance of everybody sitting down and resolving their differences. No such thing occurred. In fact, a group came to my house jumping for joy. They had split from the West Coast leadership. It really saddened me that they had not been able to sit down together and mend their differences. And remember, as she stated, that most of these differences were sort of instigated by outside forces. After I left the party, my life became more and more impossible. Everywhere I went, it seemed like I would turn around to find two detectives following behind me. I would look out my window, and there, in the middle of Harlem, in front of my house, would be two white men sitting and reading the newspaper. I was scared to death to talk in my own house. When I wanted to say something that was not public information, I turned the record player up real loud so that the buggers would have a hard time hearing. It was so weird. I still hadn't received a telephone bill, and months had gone by since I paid the last one. Yet the telephone was always working. Strange people visited my neighbors, asking questions. I hated to move from my apartment because the rent was so cheap. I was paying something like $65 a month, and if you could get used to the fifth floor walk-up, it wasn't at all bad. It was one of those rent-controlled buildings right across the street from City College where I was enrolled. I had no choice but to leave. It was impossible to live among all those bugging devices. I decided to donate the apartment to the Panthers and look for somewhere else to live and to spend time with some friends, passing a few days here and a few days there until I found another place. One day as I was zipping up the avenue on my way home, a friend called me over. "What's up?" I asked. "Don't go home." "What do you mean, don't go home?" "Your place is crawling with pigs. They're waiting for you." I walked around for a while, trying to get my head together. What could they do to me if I went home? I hadn't done anything. I thought about the Panther 21. They hadn't done anything either. Anyway, they can do anything they want. I thought about my crib. Maybe they had been taping my voice and hooking up pieces of conversation to make it seem like there was a conspiracy to do something. Maybe they would charge me with harboring a fugitive or the conspiracy to harbor a fugitive. Everybody said they were tailing me so tough because they thought I would lead them to set Deruba or some other comrade that had been forced into hiding. Maybe they would try to interrogate me, beat and torture me until I signed some phony confession or something. I decided one thing right then and there. I definitely wasn't going home, and I definitely wasn't answering anybody's questions about anything. I thought of going to Evelyn's, but I figured that as soon as I showed, the pigs would go there waiting for me. I decided the best thing I could do was lay low until I found out what was going on and could come to some decision. Okay, that's the end of chapter 15. From Assata, an autobiography. I think I'm gonna turn over the Radio Babylon to to Terry. It might be time for the rundown. Moving into another day. We have been on track. Is this the first time that we went till midnight and didn't finish?
No, first day we went on.
Okay.
Was that the end?
No, that's just the end of chapter 15. What is there?
Okay.
I was wondering if it was going to get to her exile. That lady in the book, I wouldn't expect her to still be talking about the Black Panthers.
Well, she skips around.
Oh, is that what it is?
Mm-hmm. Hello, hello. Thanks to Ricky. We'll let you know if we need anything. I'll get my key. All right. Good morning. Finished day 4. Assata Shakur, an autobiography. Next up, it's going to be Locking Up Our Own. Crime and Punishment in Black America by James Foreman Jr. But first, I'm going to
Quit reading that.
I'm going to see this. The Facebook officially locked up the page of Fred Hampton Jr. again. You don't even be on there, really.
the daily rundown. On May 30th, 2020, a protest was organized by community activists in Rockford to march in solidarity with the city of Minneapolis after the murder of George Floyd by police officer Derek Chauvin, and to bring awareness to the countless victims of police terrorism in the city of Rockford. During the protest, speeches were given by members of the community, and a march was held that ended at Rockford District 1, Police District 1. At District 1, after speeches, a handful of people at the protest began throwing rocks and other objects at District 1 building. But after discourse between community members, items ceased to be thrown and no one was injured. The officers of District 1 stayed inside of the building through the entirety of this happening, However, shortly after this, the district commander, Ken Wisenhan, led officers out of the building in riot gear. Before any order of dispersal was given, officers of the Rockford Police Department began assaulting people in attendance of the protests using cruel and unusual forms of brutality and violence. Pepper spray bullets, stomping, kicking, punching, tasing, slamming, and knees on necks were all used in efforts to terrorize children, teenagers, young adults, and the elderly. 10 people were falsely arrested and over 100 citizens were physically and psychologically damaged by the actions of local law enforcement. These are the demands of the victims of the police brutality attack of May 30th in Rockford, Illinois. Demands from the victims of the May 30th police brutality attack. Demand number 1. We demand all charges in connection to the protests on May 30th be dropped immediately without contingency on any agreement or deal being signed by the wrongfully accused parties. Demand number 2. We demand the city of Rockford procures an entity outside of the Rockford Police Department to investigate the actions taken by officers on May 30th due to the conflict of interest. Demand number 3. We demand the inherent bias findings of the Rockford Police Department investigation and the findings of the investigation done by an outside source be released in full without redaction to the public. Demand number 4. We demand to be informed of the badge number and name of each officer at Precinct 1 on May 30th, informed of each officer who made an arrest, and to be informed of each officer who discharged their taser. Demand number 5. We demand all elected officials in the city of Rockford condemn the actions taken by the Rockford Police Department on May 30th and also condemns the lack of results the investigation of the conduct of RPD on May 30th has yielded. Demand number 6. We demand the city of Rockford make accommodations and pay in full for the services of counselors, therapists, or psychiatrists, or anything else needed to help the mental health of those traumatized by the actions of their officers. The city should make accommodations for up to 12 months to pay these services for each individual. Demand number 7. We demand that all officers that participated in the violation of the human rights of the protesters on May 30th be terminated immediately and their crimes against humanity be punished to the fullest extent of the law. During the summer of 2020, weekly protests were hosted at City Market to raise awareness to the victims of the police brutality attack on May 30th in the city of Rockford, Illinois. For the first 5 weeks, these protests occurred with demonstrators assuming the role of pedestrians walking continuously on the crosswalk on East State Street and Water Street, horizontal to City Market. Megaphones were used to project the voices of activists speaking about May 30th, and siren functions of those megaphones were used to alert traffic of the ongoing demonstration, a safety precaution. All of these things occurred with no arrests and no laws broken. The Rockford Police Department even went as far as to set up roadblocks using police vehicles on multiple weeks. On July 31st, in concert with the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department, the Rockford Police Department assaulted multiple demonstrators on the crosswalk on East State Street and Water Street. In the process of arresting 14 people. For the next 8 weeks, the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department and the Rockford Police Department, along with the City of Rockford and the County of Winnebago, conspired to use terroristic tactics to intimidate citizens who participated in the protests at City Market. People were assaulted in a myriad of ways, including being pepper sprayed and slammed to the ground, in the process of 33 people in total being falsely arrested and jailed by law enforcement. The demands from #CityMarket2020. Demand number 1. We demand all charges in connection to the City Market protest be dropped immediately without contingency on any deal or agreement by the wrongfully accused parties. Demand number 2. We demand an investigation into the violation of human rights in connection with the City Market protest by the Rockford Police Department, Winnebago County Sheriff's Office, Rockford Park District, Metro Enforcement Agency, and any other agencies involved. Demand number 3, we demand all elected officials in the city of Rockford and in Winnebago County to make a public statement about the violation of human rights of protesters by the Rockford Police Department, Winnebago County Sheriff's Office, Rockford Park District, and Metro Enforcement Agency in connection to the city market protests. Demand number 4, we demand the city of Rockford and Winnebago County make accommodations and pay in full for the services of counselors, therapists, or psychiatrists, or anything else needed to help the mental health of those traumatized by the action of their officers in connection to the city market protest. The city should make accommodations for up to 12 months to pay these services to each individual. Demand number 5, we demand that the Winnebago County Sheriff's Office return all personal property, including but not limited to cell phones, speakers, and 20 megaphones, to the people who were arrested at the city market protests. Demand number 6, we demand City of Rockford and Winnebago County ban the use of chemical agents by Rockford Police Department, Winnebago County Sheriff's Office, and Metro Enforcement Agency at areas the city and county designates as protest zones. Demand number 7, we demand Sergeant Tom Brimhall's son, Adam Pickett, be charged for assault and unlawful restraint for the actions he took on a protester July 31st at the city market protest. Demand number 8, we demand that Kathy McDermott be terminated from her position at Rockford City Market and be replaced with someone who puts the community's interest above economic gain. Demand number 9, we demand Peter Provenzano and Rock River Development Partnership give ownership, all rights, and control of Rockford City Market to the city of Rockford so that it can be handled in a more equitable and democratic manner. Demand number 10, we demand that all officers that participated in the violation of the human rights of the protesters in connection to the city market protest be terminated immediately and their crimes against humanity punished to the fullest extent of the law. On October 3, 2020, a protest began in the form of an occupation outside of Rockford City Hall after Tyrus Jones, an unarmed black man, was shot in the back by Rockford Police Department officer Dominic McNeese on October 2, 2020 in Rockford, Illinois. The demands of the protesters organizing the demonstration were as reads. Demand number 1, a press conference from Rockford Mayor Tom McNamara. Demand number 2, in said press conference, Tom McNamara spoke on the shooting of Tyrus Jones and the ongoing police terrorism that took place in the spring and summer in Rockford. Demand number 3, Mayor Tom McNamara answered questions from the media at said press conference. The mayor instead released a Facebook post 2 days after the shooting in which he never even stated the name of the victim he was referring to in a statement. On October 5th, 2 of the protesters participating in the occupation were assaulted at the hands of the Rockford Police Department in the process of 6 people ultimately being arrested. Since the demands the protesters put forward were never met in full, the occupation continued through this attack, and for the next 6 months, protesters continue occupied the outside of City Hall in Rockford, Illinois. While doing so, police officers have harassed, followed, and threatened citizens. They have torn down structures being used to house people in deadly cold weather. They have stolen blankets, hand warmers, food, and clothes from protesters in the middle of the night. The city officials of Rockford who work inside of City Hall have engaged in racist microaggressions throughout the entirety of the occupation, primarily executed in the form of white people weaponizing the police on people of color. Demands from victims of Occupy City Hall. Demand number 1. We demand all charges in connection to the occupation at City Hall be dropped immediately, without contingency on any deal or agreement by the wrongfully accused parties. Demand number 2. We demand all ordinance violations, fines, and parking tickets issued by the City of Rockford in connection with the occupation at City Hall be dropped immediately, without contingency on any deal or agreement by the wrongfully accused parties. Demand number 3, we demand the City of Rockford, the Winnebago County State's Attorney, and the Rockford Police Department to release all video footage of arrests made in connection with the occupation at City Hall. Demand number 4, we demand each memorial in Say Their Name Square be up permanently without desecration from the City of Rockford or the Rockford Park District. Demand number 5, we demand the resignation of Assistant Deputy Chief Carla Red and Rockford Police Department Officer Brandon Mather for their assaults during arrests on individuals at occupation at City Hall. Demand number 6, we demand Tom McNamara hold a press conference open to the public addressing past cases of shootings by the police and the ongoing police terrorism in Rockford. Demand number 7, we demand the City of Rockford make accommodations and pay in full for the services of counselors, therapists, or psychiatrists, or anything else needed to help the mental health of those traumatized by the actions of their officers and employees in connection to the occupation at City Hall. The city should make accommodations for up to 12 months to pay these services to each individual. Demand number 8, we demand that the City of Rockford and the Rockford Police Department return all property taken from the occupation, including but not limited to canopies, a cell phone, blankets, chairs, and megaphones to the occupation at City Hall. Demand number 9, we demand Kyle Saunders be terminated from his position immediately and be replaced but with an individual that puts the community's needs over the government's interests. Demand number 10, we demand all bans from City Hall property be lifted immediately without contingency on any deal or agreement by those involved in the occupation at City Hall. Okay. So that was your Rockford rundown. Day 5 of the ongoing teach-in at Say Their Name Square. We just finished up reading the Assata, an autobiography, and now we're moving on to Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America by James Foreman, Jr. Okay, introduction. Let's get situated. This is the introduction. All of us in the public defender's office feared the Martin Luther King speech. Curtis Walker, an African-American Superior Court judge in Washington, D.C., was famous for it, and today, Brandon, my 15-year-old client, was on the receiving end. Son, your lawyer here has been telling me some good things about you, how you dote on your little sister, how your football coach says you are a born leader, how some of your teachers believe you can do better. He says he has found a program for you that will help you with school, and that I should give you a chance at that and not lock you up. Brandon had pleaded guilty to possessing a handgun and a small amount of marijuana, enough to use but not to sell. I had argued for probation. Judge Walker told Brandon he was considering my proposal, but first he had some things to say. Mr. Foreman says you need another chance, but let me ask you, do you even realize how many chances you've already had? You might think you have it hard, but let me tell you, it was harder once. Black boys picked cotton once upon a time, sat in the back of the bus, those who were lucky enough to even be on the bus and not walking. Judge Walker was getting into his rhythm now. He wasn't a preacher, but he sounded like someone who had spent more than a few Sundays in the pews. Now you can go to school, study hard, live your dreams. It isn't easy, I know that, but it is possible. And people fought, struggled, and died for that possibility. Dr. King died for that, son, And what are you doing? Not studying. No, you are cutting class, running, and thugging. Not listening to your mama or grandmother. Instead, you want to listen to some hoodlum friends. By now, the judge was glaring at Brandon. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see that Brandon was keeping his gaze steady on the judge. This was good. Judge Walker liked that. If Brandon avoided eye contact, Judge Walker would think he was being disrespectful. Well, let me tell you, Dr. King didn't march and die so that you could be a fool, so that you could be out on the street getting high, carrying a gun, and robbing people. No, young man, that was not his dream. That was not his dream at all. This was the speech I knew so well. The words changed a bit each time, but the theme stayed the same. Life is not easy for African Americans today, but is better than it was, and you best stop being a thug and start taking advantage of the opportunities that others fought so hard for. I was also familiar with the emotions etched on Judge Walker's face as he spoke: anger, frustration, and despair. I was a new public defender, but the judge had been around for a long time. He looked and sounded like somebody who was tired of lecturing black boys and a few girls, but not so tired that he wouldn't try one more time. He was mad at Brandon, but he hadn't given up on him. He just seemed like a man with no good alternatives confronting a problem that was too big for him to solve. Judge Walker paused, took his eyes from Brandon, and started looking through the case materials spread out before him. His lecture done, he was taking his time imposing a sentence. Another good sign. Judge Walker was known for giving defendants a fair trial, but if you lost, look out. Defense attorneys called him a long ball hitter, referring to the lengthy sentences he imposed. But now he was hesitating. Maybe I had persuaded him that this was not an easy case. I knew that probation was a long shot. The gun charge was serious, and worse, a report from the court's social worker claimed that Brandon hung out with other kids who were involved in some recent neighborhood robberies. But the robbery allegations were just rumors. Brandon hadn't been charged with that. As for the gun, well, Brandon lived in a terribly dangerous neighborhood, one where kids sometimes carried guns for self-defense. Most important, I had told Judge Walker this was Brandon's first arrest, and he had great potential. His football coach and two of his teachers had written letters about his promise. His family was supportive, and he had recently enrolled in a tutoring program for at-risk students. And Brandon had pleaded guilty, accepted responsibility for his actions, and been remorseful. Juvenile court was supposed to offer second chances, and Brandon was a perfect candidate. The prosecutor argued that Brandon should go to Oak Hill, D.C.'s juvenile detention facility. I had countered by pointing out what everybody knew. Oak Hill was a dungeon, with no functioning school, frequent incidents of violence, no counseling or mental health services worth the name, and no transition services for young offenders once they were released. Brandon would miss months of actual school while serving his sentence, and it was possible that the principal wouldn't take him back once he returned to his neighborhood. If this happened, there was no good alternative school he could turn to. Brandon fidgeted as we waited for Judge Walker to speak, and I tried to calm him by placing my hand gently on the back of his shoulders. I glanced behind me and offered what I hoped was a comforting smile to Brandon's mother and grandmother sitting in the first row. They had never missed a court hearing, had always voiced their support for Brandon. Now all they could do was wait. Judge Walker finally gathered the papers up into one stack and placed them back in the case file. When he spoke, the verdict was quick and painful. Brandon, he said, I believe you have potential, and I see you have supportive teachers and family, but none of that was enough to stop you from picking up a gun. Even if I believe that you had it because you were scared, you could have hurt somebody. Son, actions have consequences. Your consequence is 6 months at Oak Hill, after which I hope you make good on the hopes that your mother and grandmother have for you. which reminds me of a lot of the court support that I witness. The judges like to reprimand people after they make a plea, ask them how old they are. Oh, you got a lot of life left. Yeah, I've heard all this stuff in Rockford.
6 months.
Yeah. That was it. The bailiff, who had been sitting behind us, stepped forward to take Brandon to a cell in the courthouse. Brandon's mother gasped and started to cry. Judge Walker wouldn't like that. None of the judges did. But what could he do now? The courtroom clerk, who would probably help her out into the hallway, or so I hoped. I had to go see Brandon. The cell block was just a few feet behind the courtroom, but it was a world apart. No majesty here, no wood paneling, no carpeting or cushioned seats, just metal and concrete, housing black boys like Brandon. And make no mistake about it, they were all black. That day, Brandon's cell had 3 other black teens waiting for their cases to be called. The picture was the same in almost every D.C. courtroom, whether the accused were juveniles or adults. There were a few women and girls, but mostly men and boys. Nearly all, according to official records, more than 95%, were African American. This state of affairs was no secret. In 1995, the year Brandon came before Judge Walker, the Sentencing Project issued one of a series of increasingly alarming reports documenting blatant racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Nationally, 1 in 3 young black men was under criminal justice supervision. In Washington, D.C., the figure was 1 in 2. Racial disparities were nothing new, but now they were being exacerbated by an experiment in punitive criminal justice, the likes of which the world had never seen. Beginning in the 1970s, America had adopted an array of increasingly tough approaches to crime, including aggressive street-level policing, longer sentences, and a range of lifetime punishments such as felon disenfranchisement. The result, by 1995, a nation with only 5% of the world's population held almost 25% of its prisoners, and an ever-growing proportion of these prisoners were black. Brandon was now one of them. He looked defiant when I arrived in the cell block. I think he wanted to cry, but he definitely would not do that in front of the other kids. I told Brandon I would come to see him at Oak Hill and try to help him get through the 6 months. Do the time, don't let the time do you, the kids like to say. At that moment, I hated Judge Walker and the entire court system. Most of all, I realized I hated the Martin Luther King speech. It would be one thing, I thought, for the judge to give Brandon this speech if he was going to put him on probation. In that case, a heartfelt lecture might have done him some good. It might have been something that Brandon needed to hear, something that would encourage him to make the most of his second chance. But to invoke Dr. King while locking up another young black man, it was perverse. Surely Judge Walker had noticed that everybody in the cell a few feet away from him was black. Yet here he was, simply adding to the gross racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Where did he get off taking the moral high ground? As I saw it, I was the person in the courtroom fighting for Dr. King's legacy. I was the one doing civil rights work. I had become a public defender so that I could confront racial injustice. Just 1 year before, I had been serving as a law clerk for Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. She had encouraged me to work for the Department of Justice or join a national civil rights organization such as the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I remember her surprise when I told her that I wanted to defend poor people charged with crimes in the local courts of Washington, D.C. When Justice O'Connor asked why I wanted to be a public defender, my answer was simple. This was the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. I was literally a child of that movement. My parents had met in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, SNCC, one of the major civil rights groups in the 1960s. My dad was born in 1928, was raised in Mississippi where he ate dirt to feel full during the Great Depression. When he was 8 years old, he failed to say, "Yes, ma'am," to a store clerk, and white men in the store threatened to lynch him if his uncle brought him to town again. Active in campus politics as a student in the 1950s, my dad joined the fledgling SNCC in 1961. As the group's executive director, he ran internal operations, everything from paying the bills to expanding staff to planning strategy for voting rights drives. My mom had dropped out of Sarah Lawrence College to join SNCC's New York office in 1962. 6 months later, she became a coordinator at the group's Atlanta headquarters, raising money and communicating with SNCC chapters at northern colleges. Now, 30 years later, I was an African American clerking at the Supreme Court, beginning a professional life that would not have been possible without generations of sacrifice and struggle. But despite the gains of the civil rights movement, I knew that progress wasn't the whole story. The nation's prison population was growing darker. In 1954, the year of Brown versus the Board of Education, about 1/3 of the nation's prisoners were black. In 1994, when Justice O'Connor and I were talking, the number was approaching 50%. The criminal justice system, I told her, was where today's civil rights struggle would be fought, and my short time representing young men like Brandon had convinced me that I was right. Thoroughly pissed off, I left Brandon and returned to face his family, who I knew were probably sobbing in the hallway of the courthouse. On my way, I passed back through the courtroom where the judge, the court reporter, and the juvenile prosecutor were chatting, waiting for the next case to be called. As I passed them, I noticed another racial reality. It wasn't only Brandon and the other young men in the cell block who were black. So was everybody in the courtroom, not just the judge, but the court reporter, the bailiff, and the juvenile prosecutor. So was the police officer who had arrested Brandon, not to mention the police chief and the mayor. Even the building we were in, the H. Carl Moultrie I Courthouse, named after the city's first black chief judge, was a reminder of the African American influence on D.C.'s legal system. This wasn't my first time in an all-black D.C. courtroom, but something, probably my anger at the Martin Luther King speech, made the reality stand out that day. When I got back to my office, I continued the racial tally. I had been to the detention facility that would be Brandon's new home more times than I wanted to count, and I knew that all the guards there were black too. The city council that wrote the gun and drug laws Brandon had been convicted of violating was majority African American and had been so for more than 25 years. In cases that went to trial, the juries were often majority black. Even some of the federal officers involved in D.C.'s criminal justice system were African American, including Eric Holder, then the city's chief prosecutor. What was going on? How did a majority black jurisdiction end up incarcerating so many of its own? Over time, I have come to see this question, though particularly urgent in Washington, D.C., is of national significance. In September 2014, the Sentencing Project issued a report comparing the attitudes of white and blacks regarding crime and criminal justice policy. It found that when Americans were asked, "Do you think the courts in this area deal too harshly or not harshly enough with criminals?" More whites, 73%, than blacks, 64%, said not harshly enough. Media coverage of the report emphasized what the sentencing project called the racial gap and punitiveness. But the fact that almost two-thirds of blacks displayed such punitive attitudes received little notice. How could it be that even after 40 years of tough-on-crime tactics, with their attendant toll on black America, 64% of African Americans still thought the courts were not harsh enough? Well, it's not like it is in Rockford. There's not a single all-black courtroom in Winnebago County. I don't think there's any black judges. Black bailiffs, that's about it. No clerks that I know of. Yeah, it's pretty much all white. I wrote this book to try to answer such questions. Along the way, I have tried to recover a portion of African American social, political, and intellectual history. A story that gets ignored or eluded when we fail to appreciate the role that blacks have played in shaping criminal justice policy over the past 40 years. African Americans perform this role as citizens, voters, mayors, legislators, prosecutors, police officers, police chiefs, corrections officers, and community activists. Their influence grew as a result of black progress in attaining political power, especially after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And their constituents supported tough-on-crime measures. To understand why, we must start with a profound social fact. In the years preceding and during our punishment binge, black communities were devastated by historically unprecedented levels of crime and violence, spurred by a heroin epidemic. Homicides doubled and tripled in D.C. and many other American cities throughout the 1960s. 2 decades later, heroin would be eclipsed by crack, a terrifying drug whose addictive qualities and violent marketplace caused some contemporaries to label it the worst thing to hit us since slavery. Letters from black citizens, neighborhood association newsletters, and the pages of the black press from the past 40 years reveal astonishing levels of pain, fear, and anger. In 1968, a group of black nationalists in D.C. called drug dealers black-faced traders of our people who sell dope to our young boys and girls and make whores and thieves of them. A decade later, a black D.C. neighborhood association circulated a flyer promoting ways to defend homes from break-ins. The list included guard dogs, security alarms, wild snakes, and for those with fewer resources, fish hooks strung around doors and windows to puncture the flesh of would-be burglars. By the 1980s and 1990s, the files of D.C. council members were crammed with letters from scared constituents complaining that we feel like prisoners in our own homes, strangers in our own streets, and begging for more police action. As they confronted this devastating crime wave, black officials exhibited a complicated and sometimes overlapping mix of impulses. Some displayed tremendous hostility towards perpetrators of crime, describing them as a cancer that had to be cut away from the rest of the black community. Others pushed for harsher penalties, but acknowledged that these measures would not solve the crisis at hand. Some even expressed sympathy for the plight of criminal defendants, who they knew were disproportionately black, but that sympathy was rarely sufficient to overcome the claims of black crime victims, who often argued that a punitive approach was necessary to protect the African American community including many of its more impoverished members, from the ravages of crime. I'm going to grab a blanket. It's getting a cold wind. Many black officials advocated tough-on-crime measures in race-conscious terms. For example, some blacks oppose racial marijuana discrimination because they saw it as tantamount to giving up on black youth they had a responsibility to protect from the destructive impact of drug use. Others argued that blacks were entitled to expanded police forces and courts, state resources they had historically been denied. Some, like Judge Walker, believed they were protecting the legacy of the civil rights movement in the face of the black community's self-immolation. In documenting the range of black responses to crime, this book repudiates a claim sometimes made by defenders of the criminal justice system, that African Americans protest police violence while ignoring violence by black criminals. There is much to say to this critique. Not least, of course, we hold government to a higher standard than street gangs, but these pages suggest another response. African Americans have always viewed the protection of black lives as a civil rights issue, whether the threat comes from police officers or street criminals. Far from ignoring the issue of crime by blacks against other blacks, African American officials and their constituents have been consumed by it. This book tells a story about what African Americans thought, said, and did. But in focus on the action of black officials, I do not minimize the role of whites or of racism in the development of mass incarceration. To the contrary, racism shaped the political, economic, and legal context in which the black community and its elected representatives made their choices. From felon disenfranchisement laws that suppressed black votes to exploitive housing practices that strip black wealth, to schools that refuse to educate black children, to win-at-all-costs prosecutors who strike blacks from jury pools, to craven politicians who earn votes by preying on racial anxieties. to the unconscious and implicit biases that infect us all, it is impossible to understand American crime policy without appreciating racism's enduring role. We witnessed another example of the enduring power of race baiting in the 2016 presidential election campaign. Donald Trump, whose signature contribution to political debate had been his relentless propagation of the lie that Barack Obama is not an American citizen, ran the most racist presidential campaign since the arch-segregationist George Wallace 1968 bid. While Latinos and Muslims were Trump's principal targets, African Americans were far from immune. In particular, Trump revived the law and order mantra that Republicans such as Goldwater, Nixon, and Reagan had once used to great effect, portraying America's black neighborhoods as killing fields whose only hope lay in aggressive policing. We don't yet know how this campaign theme will translate into policy over the course of the Trump presidency, but the prospect of more stop and frisk and less federal civil rights oversight of local police departments is ominous indeed. These pages reveal the myriad ways in which American racism narrowed the options available to black citizens and elected officials in their fight against crime. For example, African Americans wanted more law enforcement, but they didn't want only law enforcement. Many adopted what we might think of an all-of-the-above strategy. On one hand, they supported fighting drugs and crime with every resource on the state's disposal, including police, courts, and prisons. On the other hand, they called for jobs, schools, and housing, what many themed a Marshall Plan for urban America. But because African Americans are a minority nationally, they needed help to win national action against poverty, joblessness, segregation, and other root causes of crime. The help never arrived. The requests for assistance came at a time when Reaganism was ascendant. The society was under assault, and there was little national appetite for social programs, especially those perceived as helping blacks. So African Americans never got the Marshall Plan, just the tough on crime laws. Understanding African American attitudes and actions on matters of crime and punishment requires that we pay careful attention to another topic that is often overlooked in criminal justice scholarship: class divisions within the black community. Although mass incarceration harms black America as a whole, its most direct victims are the poorest, least educated blacks. While the lifetime risk of incarceration skyrockets for African American male high school dropouts with the advent of mass incarceration, it actually decreased slightly for black men with some college education. As a result, by the year 2000, the lifetime risk of incarceration for black high school dropouts was 10 times higher than it was for African Americans who had attended college. These class dynamics drove elected officials towards a tough on crime stance in some predictable ways. For example, longer sentences for burglary are unsurprising, since they put mostly poor black burglars behind bars and leave mostly middle-class black homes protected. But class divisions influence criminal justice debates in black communities in less obvious ways as well. They explain, for example, why black elected officials have been much more likely to speak out against racial profiling, which harms African Americans of all classes, than against unconscionable prison conditions, which have little direct impact on middle-class or elite blacks. Finally, the incremental and diffuse way the war on crime was waged made it difficult for some African American leaders to appreciate the impact of the choices they were making. Mass incarceration wasn't created overnight. Its components were assembled piecemeal over a 40-year period, and those components are many. The police make arrests, pretrial service agencies recommend bond, prosecutors make charging decisions, defense lawyers defend, sometimes. Juries adjudicate, in the rare case that doesn't plead. Legislators establish the sentence ranges. Judges impose sentences within these ranges. Corrections departments run prisons. Probation and parole officers supervise released offenders, and so on. The result is an almost absurdly disaggregated and uncoordinated criminal justice system, or non-system, as Daniel Freed once called it. Although the existence of this diffuse structure is not new, we have yet to comprehend how the lack of coordination has contributed to the growth of our carceral system. In a tough on crime era, no single actor doubles or triples the incarceration rate. But as we shall see, if all the actors become even somewhat more punitive, and if they all do so at the same time, the number of people in prison and under criminal justice supervision skyrockets. Yet nobody has to take responsibility for the outcome because nobody is responsible, at least not fully. This lack of responsibility is crucial to understanding why even reluctant or conflicted crime warriors, which some African Americans were and are, become part of the machinery of mass incarceration, and why the system continues to churn even to this day when its human toll has become increasingly apparent. This book is an account of a city in crisis where rates of crime and violence rose to unprecedented levels. It explores the acts and attitudes of African American citizens and leaders, of men and women like Judge Walker. When he locked Brandon up, I was furious. Yet in the course of my research, I encountered many people like the judge, and I have come to better understand their motives. I have tried to tell their story fairly, describing the relentless pressure they are under to save a community that seems to be crumbling before their eyes. This is also a book about my clients, men and women like Brandon. They too struggled with limited options. They made mistakes and sometimes harmed others, but they deserve better than the criminal justice system in which they were trapped. So that was the introduction to Day 5 book, Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America. Part 1, Origins. Chapter 1, Gateway to the War on Drugs, Marijuana, 1975. So that's after President Nixon had a commission investigate marijuana or cannabis, and it came back and said that there was no reason why it should be illegal, and that it was medicinal, and he basically suppressed that commission report and then started jacking up the punitive aspect of cannabis. But then it was before 1975. It was before Reagan when the war on drugs really kicked off, leading to mass incarceration. Gateway to the war on drugs, marijuana, 1975. Every generation makes mistakes. Sometimes these errors are relatively harmless or easily fixed, but every so often a misstep is so damaging that future generations are left shaking their heads in disbelief. What were they thinking? We ask each other. How did they not see what they were doing? Excuse me. We gaze out at the wreckage we've inherited, the failed policies and broken lives, and we think this was avoidable. The war on drugs, including the turn towards ever more punitive sentencing, is likely to be judged that sort of mistake. It is now widely recognized that the drug war has caused tremendous damage, especially in the low-income African American communities that have been its primary target. In 1995, the legal scholar Michael Tonry, and an early critic of the war on drugs, said it foreseeably and necessarily blighted the lives of hundreds of thousands of young, disadvantaged black Americans. In the years since Tonry wrote those words, the consequences of the policies he denounced have only intensified. Blacks are much more likely than whites to be arrested, convicted, and incarcerated for drug offenses, even though blacks are no more likely than whites to use drugs. And although blacks play a greater role in street-level drug distribution in most markets than do whites, the best research has shown that this does not explain all the racial disparities in incarceration rates. Marijuana produces particularly blatant arrest disparities in Washington, D.C. The black arrest rate for marijuana possession in 2010 was 8 times that for whites, and in the same year, law enforcement in the city made 5,393 marijuana possession arrests, nearly 15 arrests a day. All of which raises the question, why would black people ever have supported the drug war? Answering this question requires that we return to a time before the drug war achieved unstoppable momentum and before a massive increase in incarceration rates made America the world's largest jailer. In the early to mid-1970s, a majority black city had the chance to say no to a policy that stigmatized many young blacks and diminished their life prospects. The choice that city made presaged the subsequent course of the tough on crime movement in black America. Hey, we didn't get our 40 acres and a mule, said George Clinton, frontman of the funk band Parliament. But we did get you, CC. CC was Chocolate City, and Chocolate City was Washington, D.C. There were other chocolate cities in the United States. We've got Newark, we got Gary. Somebody told me we got L.A., and we're working on Atlanta. But D.C. was special, as Clinton put it. You're the capital, CC. The year was 1975, and D.C.'s black citizens, who made up 70% of the city's population, had good reason to celebrate. Since Reconstruction, Congress had denied the city's residents any meaningful role in their own governance. Southern Democrats controlled the district, and they had no interest in granting even a measure of self-determination to a city with so many black residents. South Carolina Representative John L. McMillan ran the House of Representatives District Committee during the 1950s and 1960s, an avowed racist. He viewed the district as his private plantation. stocking the local government with cronies who shared his antipathy towards blacks. But McMillan and other white supremacists were losing their grip on black people's fate. The election of black mayors across the country demonstrated how the nation was changing. In 1967, there was Carl Stokes in Cleveland, followed by Kenneth Gibson in Newark in 1970. Then 3 years later, Tom Bradley in Los Angeles, Maynard Jackson in Atlanta, and Coleman Young in Detroit. And then D.C. got its turn. In 1973, Congress passed the Home Rule Act, set it to take effect in January 1975. Although he stopped well short of making D.C. fully autonomous, the Home Rule Act provided for an elected mayor with substantial executive authority, including control of the police department, and for a city council with significant legislative power. Elections were held on November 5, 1974. 2 months later, on January 2, 1975, the nation's first black Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, swore in D.C.'s first elected black mayor in 100 years, Walter E. Washington. Before his election, Washington had been serving as an appointed mayor-commissioner, a mostly ceremonial position. Even this limited status had infuriated Representative McMillan, who protested by sending a truckload of watermelons to Washington's office. Marshall also swore in the city's first elected city council, 11 of whose 13 members were black. Behind them on the stage, a police band played Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On. The district building hosted a public reception, and the city's residents crowded in, congratulating their newly elected officials and collecting autographs on souvenir programs. President Gerald Ford delivered a statement through a representative declaring that the power that should have been in Washington all along is now back in Washington, the right of every citizen to have a voice in his or her government. So when Parliament released the album Chocolate City, it was only fitting that the title song's refrain was "Gainin' on Ya," and that the cover art featured the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, and the Capitol Building all coated in chocolate. The song even opened with a playful prediction: they still call it the White House, but that's a temporary condition too. In 1975, D.C.'s racial composition meant that except in Ward 3, the city's only majority white district, any white candidate seeking a seat on the new city council needed a biography that could appeal to black voters. In Ward 1, which included the Shaw, U Street, and Columbia Heights neighborhoods, such a candidate emerged, someone who would spark one of the newly empowered city's first debates about criminal justice. David Clark was a graduate of the Howard University School of Law, where he had been one of a handful of white students. After earning his degree, he took a job in Washington, D.C., office of Dr. Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. A few years later, he opened his own private practice and quickly gained a reputation for representing the underdog. As one friend remembered, if you got in trouble, everyone knew to get David Clark because you didn't have to pay him. We need more David Clarks in Rockford. When Home Rule arrived, Clark jumped eagerly into the race for city council. His was the classic grassroots campaign. Headquartered in his one-bedroom apartment, It made up in passion what it lacked in money. Ultimately, district voters were convinced by Clark's authenticity, compassion, and civil rights pedigree. And on Inauguration Day, he was sworn in as one of 2 white members to the city council. Once in office, Clark turned his attention to what he regarded as a matter of pressing importance: the increasingly vigorous enforcement of marijuana laws by the Metropolitan Police Department, or MPD. Marijuana arrests had jumped from 334 in 1968 to 3,002 in 1975, a 900% increase. Moreover, 80% of those arrested were black, and having this arrest on their records could undermine their life chances, making it harder for them to obtain housing, jobs, public benefits, or student loans. Clark's election coincided with the national movement to decriminalize marijuana. Today, we connect the drug war with Richard Nixon, who in 1971 famously announced a new all-out offensive against drugs, the nation's public enemy number one. But Nixon's offensive was largely aimed at harder drugs. It is easy to forget that this same era saw substantial momentum for making possession of small amounts of marijuana a civil infraction. For which citizens would get a ticket rather than a criminal offense, for which they could be arrested and jailed. This movement garnered so much support that by 1975, the widespread decriminalization of marijuana seemed wholly possible, even inevitable. Advocates of decriminalization came from many quarters. In 1970, the Controlled Substance Act had established the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, an investigative body deemed conservatively oriented by the Washington Post. Over the following 2 years, the Commission conducted dozens of hearings and authorized more than 50 research projects, with several members even trying marijuana for themselves. Finally, in 1972, the Commission released its highly publicized final report titled Marijuana, A Signal of Misunderstanding. The report was far more sympathetic to marijuana than many observers had expected. Experimental or intermittent use of this drug carries minimal risk to the public health, the report declared, and should not be given overzealous attention. The report was too permissive for President Nixon, who immediately rejected it, but it gave a much-needed boost to decriminalization advocates at the state level, where they notched some victories. Oregon decriminalized marijuana in 1973. 2 years later, California, Colorado, Ohio, and Alaska followed suit. Support for decriminalization came from unlikely sources like William F. Buckley and his staunchly conservative National Review, which in 1972 ran a cover story with the headline, "The Time Has Come, Abolish the Pot Laws." In 1977, President Jimmy Carter opened the door to federal legislation asking Congress to decriminalize the possession of small amounts of marijuana. Penalties against possession of a drug should not be more damaging to an individual than the use of the drug itself, Carter declared in a message to Congress. Despite the liberalizing shift in attitudes in parts of the country, the Washington, D.C. police did not let up, and they concentrated their attention on the city's black neighborhoods. That 80% of those they arrested were black may not have been an egregious disparity in a city that was 70% black, but for David Clark the number proved an important point. In overwhelmingly white states such as Oregon and Maine, marijuana decriminalization was a question of of civil liberties and individual autonomy, but in majority black Washington, D.C., it was also a pressing matter of civil rights and racial justice. That D.C.'s police force would dramatically increase marijuana arrests at a time when the national momentum was moving towards lesser penalties was, in a word, infuriating. He's got a graph. I'll show you the graph. On the left is 1968, and it goes up to 1975, and then the amount of arrests goes from 0 to 3,500. And it curves up. Luckily, Clark found himself in the perfect position to effect change. After his victory, he had been named head of the City Council's Committee on the Judiciary and Criminal Law, which most referred to simply as the Judiciary Committee. He quickly took aim at the city's marijuana laws. On March 18, 1975, Clark unveiled a proposal to eliminate prison as a possible penalty for possession. Instead, anyone possessing less than 2 ounces of marijuana would be subject to a $100 fine. At the time, marijuana possession carried the same maximum penalty as sale of the drug, a year in prison and a $1,000 fine. The maximum increased to 10 years and $5,000 for any subsequent offense. Clark also proposed that police officers issue citations rather than make arrests. Clark's bill would pass only if he could persuade his black colleagues and Walter Washington, the city's black mayor, to view the issue through a civil rights lens. So on July 16th, Clark opened Judiciary Committee hearings documenting the disparate racial impact of marijuana-related arrests and prosecutions in D.C. Several witnesses testified in favor of the bill, including D.C. Superior Court Judge Charles Halleck. Halleck, a former prosecutor, had forsworn his tough-on-crime roots. According to the Washington Post, in the early 1970s, he grew a beard and moderately long hair and became, in the eyes of some, as pro-defendant as he had once been pro-prosecution. Like Clark, Halleck was white, but also like Clark, he had directly observed the ways in which D.C.'s criminal justice system targeted young black men. He was particularly critical of the MPD for its selective enforcement of marijuana possession laws. The officers, he asserted, routinely stopped cars that contained more than one black male and proceeded to jack up people that they search. If they found even one marijuana cigarette, Halleck said, the police would gleefully arrest an entire car full of young black men. They look in somebody's ashtray and seize a roach, he testified. That justifies an arrest. As additional witnesses spoke, it became clear that the selective enforcement of D.C. marijuana laws extended well beyond the police. The Washington Urban League presented research demonstrating that prosecutors were more likely to pursue cases involving black defendants and to dismiss cases involving whites. The disparities held even when controlling for variables such as employment and education. Blacks with jobs were more likely to receive punishment than similarly employed whites, and black students fared worse than white ones. Oh. Denzel just attacked me. No, he didn't. Just a sign. I'm gonna have to go on the ground. It's getting windy. Oh. Yeah. hold on a minute. I'm going to have to get stuff organized here. Keep that page. Throw some of the stuff in a bag. Okay. Back up. So that wind blew in some rain. All right. But the most devastating impact, witnesses agreed, was the lifelong stigma that came from a relatively minor offense, invoking a story that remains familiar today. Multiple witnesses testified to the collateral damage of minor drug conviction, consequences that could be more debilitating and enduring than any sentence imposed by a judge. Dr. Vincent Rue, chairman of the D.C. United Way, noted that the burden of criminality haunted black men long after their arrests. He lambasted the criminal justice system for its ability to almost destroy a person's life by a criminal record, and placed special emphasis on the system's ability to prosecute and intimidate black men in particular. Judge Halleck, for his part, argued that the ultimate effect of marijuana enforcement was to stigmatize those young men with arrest records and criminal records. Even if the majority of such men avoided jail time, he continued, they still had to report their arrests and convictions on employment, housing, and school applications. A criminal record would often render young black men effectively unemployable, creating a downward spiral of criminality. Some of these men, Halleck argued, would inevitably become angry with the system, frustrated by their inability to find work. They may go around and shoplift something, and suddenly from there they are off on the road to winding up down at Lorton for long periods of time. For most of the period covered by this book, D.C. prisoners were held at Lorton Reformatory in Lorton, Virginia. Oh man. Got a pillow blown around. Sorry. Oh, it's going in the puddle. We've been lucky the first 4 days with the weather. Getting a little taste of what it's going to be like when it turns nasty. Oh boy. Okay, so we're on page 24 of chapter 1 of Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America by James Foreman Jr. Although racial justice was a prominent theme in the case for decriminalization, Clark and his allies did not rest there. Their other central claim was that marijuana was much less dangerous than other drugs, and that criminalization was therefore a severe overreaction. Dr. Lester Grinspoon of the Massachusetts Mental Health Center sought to dispel what he called the many myths about marijuana. He told the council that marijuana was not addictive, that it did not cause psychosis or brain damage, that it was not a gateway to more serious drugs, and that it did not undermine an individual's drive to succeed. Other experts were more equivocal about the health risks that users faced, but all agreed that when it came to small amounts of marijuana, criminalization produced more harm than the drug itself. As Robert DuPont, the head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, argued, there were many ways for the government to discourage marijuana use, but to do so through the criminal justice system with its associated costs and stigmas made no sense at all. By the end of the hearings, Clark and his witnesses had offered a compelling case for why D.C. should join the growing number of states adopting a less punitive approach to marijuana. By abolishing criminal penalties for limited possession, the city council could take a firm stand for racial justice. It could save legions of black citizens from the lasting consequences of arrest and conviction. And it could adopt instead penalties that would be commensurate with the drug's actual risks. Passing Clark's bill, it seemed, was the obvious choice. What could possibly stand in the way? Heroin. As a nation, we've mostly forgotten about the devastation heroin wrought in urban America 50 years ago. When I talk in my law school classroom about the war on drugs, my students usually assume that I'm speaking about the response to crack, which ravaged black communities in the 1980s and 1990s. A few students have first-hand memories of the crack epidemic. The rest have either read about it or seen it represented in movies and on TV. But when I tell them that heroin was to the 60s what crack was to the late 80s, I get blank stares. This amnesia comes at a cost. Without taking heroin into account, one cannot understand African American attitudes towards the drug war. Heroin had long troubled D.C. A 1955 government report called the city's drug problem serious and tragic and expensive and ominous. But by the late 1960s, what had been a problem became an epidemic. Heroin began to devour the city's poor black neighborhoods. Studies at the D.C. Central Detention Facility, commonly known as the D.C. Jail, revealed the extent of the crisis. In the early to mid-1960s, less than 3% of new inmates were addicted to heroin. But beginning in 1967, the growth rate exploded, tripling by 1968, and then tripling again by February 1969. By June 1969, an astonishing 45% of the men admitted to the jail were addicts. In the city itself, the number of addicts rose from 5,000 in early 1970 to 18,000 by Christmas of that year. In 1971, there were about 15 times more heroin addicts in Washington, D.C. than in all of England. These addicts were overwhelmingly likely to be young black men. Many had dropped out of high school. The former Urban League executive director, Whitney Young, warned that children as young as 11 or 12 were dying from heroin overdoses. But the drug didn't simply destroy its users' own lives. Each new addict was another person, strung out, unemployable, and often desperate, whose number one priority was securing the means to stay high. A study of Washington, D.C. and 3 other cities found that the average heroin addict committed more than 300 crimes a year. The devastation in these cities' poor black communities took many forms. As overdose deaths skyrocketed, parents buried their children. As fear of robberies and burglaries spread, residents stayed home with doors and windows bolted shut. As desperate young addicts resorted to stealing from their kin, families were forced to turn against their own. DC's heroin epidemic produced 2 main responses. The first came from the government, a public health effort, heavy on treatment and light on law enforcement. This strategy was pioneered by Jerome Jaffe, the director of the Nixon administration's Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention, who advocated methadone maintenance, the practice of providing addicts with a free synthetic alternative to heroin in the form of 40 to 80 milligram stabilization doses of government-regulated methadone. Only a few addicts were expected to overcome their addiction. The real benefit was for the community, since the drug user who substituted methadone for heroin would no longer need to rob and steal to support his habit. And D.C. Jaffe's disciple, Robert DuPont, set up maintenance centers around the city, and any adult who had been addicted to heroin for at least 2 years was eligible to receive daily stabilization doses from trained medical personnel. The second response to the epidemic was organized by local activists, neighborhood leaders, and community groups. Among the most prominent was a black nationalist named Hassan Jaru Ahmed. Hassan, who preferred being referred to by his first name, was a tall, slender man who once made a living selling wigs. A high school dropout, recovering addict, and former federal prisoner, Hassan had been converted by his experience with addiction and crime into an unrelenting drug warrior. Like DuPont, Hassan viewed heroin as DC's most urgent problem, and methadone as part of the solution. But that was the extent of their agreement. For Hassan, methadone was useful only as a strategy for weaning addicts off heroin. He wanted it to be administered in exceedingly small doses, just enough to dull the pain of heroin withdrawal for a few months at most. But methadone maintenance to Hassan just meant substituting one addiction for another. In rejecting methadone maintenance, Hassan dismissed the core of DuPont's anti-crime strategy. He didn't doubt that methadone users would commit fewer crimes, but he was loath to accept masses of black citizens strung out and completely dependent on government narcotics. It would be a dreary eulogy, he declared, to read in the future history that America solved all problems except the drug problem and allowed her enemies to poison her to death through her youth. In Hassan's view, criminality was a symptom of addiction and methadone maintenance merely a surface treatment. The far better strategy was to cure the disease. Hassan's claim resonated widely in Black D.C. As William Raspberry, the first African-American columnist for the Washington Post, argued, the guy who was sick on heroin is just as sick on methadone. The streets may be a little safer, but the addict is scarcely better off. Hassan founded the Black Man's Development Center, BDC, in May of 1969, and it quickly became one of the most active anti-drug organizations in the city. The BDC worked closely with Hassan's other organizations, the United Moorish Republic and the Black Man's Volunteer Army of Liberation. Hassan called himself the Army's commanding officer. At its peak, the BDC had more than 700 members, many of them ex-addicts like Hassan. The BDC's anger at DuPont and his Narcotics Treatment Administration, NTA, was rooted in America's history of racial subjugation. Hassan and his colleagues believed that whites wanted blacks to be addicted to narcotics because it made them passive. In the BDC's eyes, methadone maintenance was a thinly veiled attempt to keep black people oppressed. In a series of posters plastered all over the city, the BDC condemned heroin addiction as slavery, 1969. At any one of the organization's three field offices, users could find a place to live during their initial detox periods and then enter long-term educational and counseling programs. This is drug-free cure, read a sign outside one office, not methadone maintenance. So there's a picture of that. This is a drug cure, not methadone maintenance. DuPont and Hassan also diverged when it came to the question of drug dealers. DuPont had little to say about them. He figured that his methadone maintenance plan would cause the heroin market to dry up. But the BDC had no interest in a heroin substitute. It wanted drugs off the street altogether, and that meant going after the people who had brought drugs to the street in the first place. The ultimate enemies were the white dealers, many with mafia connections at the top of the country's drug distribution networks. As one call to arms, BDC poster asserted, the only people that can break white-faced dog mafia selling illegal heroin and other dope to our school children, our families, is ourselves. The other enemy came from within the community, black street dealers. These men were vilified for their complicity in the white-controlled system of racial exploitation. Got some lightning. I'm safe though. I'm under a cover. On this point, a BDC flyer could not have been clearer. We must deal with the black-faced traitors of our people who sell dope to our young boys and girls and make whores and thieves of them for white-faced dog dealers. Since America had never cared for its black poor, it was up to D.C.'s honest, law-abiding black residents to protect their community, to take care of the race traitors in their midst by calling Hassan's anonymous hotline. Anywhere that you see them, let us know. We will deal with them ourselves, the flyer read. They will be personally warned just once. If they do not stop immediately, we will stop them. While drug sellers were among the most reviled figures in the black community, heroin users were hardly free from scorn. Hassan's BDC showed little tolerance for users, especially those who committed crimes to sustain their habits. The organization warned them to stop and offered them a chance at treatment. Those who declined the offer were frequently reported to the police or roughed up. Marion Barry, the city's future mayor, shared Hassan's impatience with heroin addicts. In 1967, he had founded Pride, a program designed to help unskilled D.C. youth find jobs. While speaking to Carol Harvey, a D.C. government official, Barry expressed doubts about allowing users to enroll. "Goddamn junkies would steal from their mothers," he said. "I don't know whether we should let them in the program." Although Hassan advocated punitive actions against drug sellers, it is important to remember that he also called for root cause solutions to the heroin epidemic, improving schools, fighting racism, and an ethic of black responsibility that valued hard work, education, and self-discipline. In this respect, he represented the all of the above approach to addressing drug use and crime. Accordingly, the BDC extended job training and drug treatment programs with one hand and turned drug dealers over to the police with the other. Hassan was, in the words of one federal prosecutor, a gutsy informant. Wow. Hold on to your shorts. In Hassan's view, the police were not doing enough to protect black neighborhoods from the drug trade. We look around us and there is a man down the block selling narcotics, and he sells it to school children. Hassan recounted, but the police would often refuse to take action, citing technicalities and red tape. The BDC, which was not hampered by the Constitution or by bureaucracy, believed that it had a mandate from the community to stop the drug traffic by any means necessary. Its members were familiar with the city's corners and alleys, with the nooks and crannies of D.C.'s drug marketplace. So when the city's police officers failed to do their jobs, a shadow force was prepared to step in. There are not many Hassans around today, but though his virulent anti-drug rhetoric is no longer in fashion, it was common back in the 1970s, and not just in D.C. Similar language was heard in Detroit, which, like D.C., was overwhelmed by rising crime and addiction. At a prayer breakfast celebrating the inauguration of Coleman Young, Detroit's first black mayor, Judge Damon Keith urged Young to tackle the crime epidemic. Your administration will have to devise a means of ridding this city, root and branch, of the criminals who are committing murders, rapes, and assaults on the people of this city. For Keith, this included going after the drug pusher, who must be exposed and brought to the bar of justice. When Young followed Keith to the podium, he brought the majority black audience of more than 2,000 people to its feet with a promise to do just that. I issue an open warning right now to all dope pushers, to all rip-off artists, to all muggers. It's time to leave Detroit. Some of the nation's most effective black anti-drug activists were based in Harlem, New York, where church leaders, community groups, and the local black press demanded a more hard-nosed response to the city's heroin crisis. The leader of Harlem's anti-drug coalition, profiled in Michael Fortner's book Black Silent Majority, was a firebrand of a minister named Oberia Dempsey. Unlike Hassan, Dempsey did not embrace the all-of-the-above approach. The only answer to the narcotic problem in America is law enforcement, he proclaimed in a letter to the Amsterdam News, New York's leading black paper. Reverend Dempsey demanded that the city, state, and federal governments dispatch more officers to help get heroin off the street and impose much more longer sentences for both users and sellers. He also called on the government to erect health camps or citizens conservation camps throughout the country, far away from cities, and take every known addict and thug off the streets. In Dempsey's vision, society would rehabilitate offenders through incarceration, locking them away for a period of 10 years or more, and providing the poorer the proper help to help the unfortunate help themselves. In the meantime, law-abiding blacks needed to arm themselves. After being stabbed above the eye near his home in 1971, Dempsey called on the residents of Harlem to carry weapons in order to ward off these hoodlums. Dempsey tapped into rich veins of anger and fear, and he wasn't alone. In 1973, in the midst of a crime wave that paralleled DC's in both swiftness and severity, the New York-based NAACP, Citizens Mobilization Against Crime, demanded that the government lengthen minimum prison terms for muggers, pushers, and first-degree murderers. That same year, the Amsterdam News advocated mandatory life sentences for the non-addict drug pusher of hard drugs. The paper's editors defined drug dealing as an act of cold, calculated, premeditated, indiscriminate murder of our community. In all three cities, one of the more common and, in retrospect, striking aspects of anti-drug rhetoric was its militant character. This was a black nation fresh off the battlefields of Selma and Watts. Few doubted that blacks were a minority tribe under continual assault. Under such conditions, many viewed drug dealers as the enemy within. The fifth column that had to be identified and eliminated. When a black teenager he mentored died of a heroin overdose, the Harlem-based writer Ord Combs captured the era's outrage. We know that the people who make millions every year from our children's misery are white, but we also know that no white man comes into our Harlems to sell his packets of doom. That work is done by black men and women who have no qualms about selling our future so that their present can be made flashy with an air-conditioned two-tone Eldorado. Having lost faith in law enforcement, Coombs advocated taking up arms against drug dealers on a national scale. Those of us who fight for our children's lives know what we have to do, he wrote in 1970. We must walk through our Harlems and find the black pushers and kill them in their burgundy jumpsuits. Coombs was anguished to find himself endorsing black-on-black vigilante justice, but he saw no other choice. If after all our talk about black pride, we cannot be responsible for ourselves, we cannot rid our neighborhoods of death, he wrote, then we should cease forever all talk about a black nation. Or as a civil rights activist explained to the black columnist William Raspberry, the pusher, as the conscious agent of those who would destroy black people, is a dangerous enemy and must be destroyed. David Clark understood heroin's toll, but as he saw it, that had nothing to do with marijuana, which had caused no such harm. Indeed, he used the example of heroin and other hard drugs as a foil. Marijuana, he argued, was not a gateway to harder drugs. It was a drug of a different kind and didn't warrant the same criminal justice response. One of his fellow council members, however, saw things differently. Douglas Moore led the charge against Clark's proposal, picking up right where Hassan had left off. By 1975, Hassan and his Black Man's Development Center were no longer a political force. The organization was in decline as a result of allegations of anti-Semitism combined with questions about its finances. To abandon the fight against marijuana, Moore argued, would be to abandon the black community. In his eyes, the simple misstep of marijuana experimentation carried dramatic risks for blacks, and especially for poor black youth, a life of addiction, crime, and degradation. Like Clark, Moore came to this D.C. Council from the Civil Rights Movement, but unlike Clark, who had been affiliated with King's relatively moderate Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Moore represented the more radical tradition of black nationalism. Like many nationalists of his era, Moore had left the United States in the 1960s. Stopping first in France and then settling in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a nation of special interests for black activists. Patrice Lumumba, the Congo's Pan-Africanist prime minister, was a venerated figure for the black left, especially after he was assassinated, with many believing the CIA's assistance. When Moore returned to the United States in 1966, he decided to live in D.C., home to Howard University, his alma mater. Again, his geographic choice was unsurprising. With its majority black population, D.C. was becoming increasingly attractive to a generation of educated, politicized blacks, a generation tired of living in white-dominated environments. In addition, Moore saw D.C. as a domestic front in the global black nationalist struggle. Despite their majority status, the city's blacks still lived as second-class, economically marginalized citizens, and the district itself was fighting to secure independence. I saw that the situation here was the same as in Africa, Moore told the Washington Post reporter Juan Williams. In Africa, the blacks are in the bad houses, the bad schools, just like in Washington. Moore quickly found his political home in the Black United Front, the coalition founded in 1968 by Stokely Carmichael. Carmichael had moved to D.C. after leaving SNCC, which he had helped lead into the Black Power era. The two men soon became political allies and close friends. Moore often officiated at Carmichael's marriage. The two men soon became political allies and close friends. Moore even officiated at Carmichael's marriage to Miriam Makeba, the South African singer and civil rights activist. When the newlyweds left for Guinea in 1969, Moore assumed leadership of the Black United Front. Wearing a dashiki, a black leather coat, and sunglasses, Moore became a well-known local activist, and few were surprised when he decided to run for a seat on the inaugural city council. Moore campaigned as a champion of the city's black poor, promoting self-determination and control of local institutions, and actively opposing efforts by white outsiders to tell DC's blacks how to govern themselves. When it came to criminal justice, Moore wanted to increase the number of blacks and women on the police force, and he openly challenged the racial and class biases pervading the system. All too frequently, he argued, whether and how long a person is imprisoned is dependent not on guilt or the nature of the crime, but on the race and socio-economic status of all of the alleged offender. Moore's reformist spirit won him the endorsement of the Prison Campaign Committee, a group of inmates at the D.C. jail. We are using the same criteria in picking candidates as the court system uses in determining our sentences, wrote the group's leader, and that is by looking at a person's record. Ultimately, Moore's message resonated outside the prison, too. Of the 17 candidates for the 2 at-large council seats, he received more votes than everyone but Marion Barry. Months later, when David Clark recommended the partial decriminalization of marijuana, Moore used his new platform to launch a withering critique of the proposed legislation. He rejected Clark's claims that the law would help blacks, arguing that America had never been concerned about drug use in the black community. This argument arose from the central paradox of the African American experience: simultaneous over and under policing of crime. In 1968, for example, in the wake of racial turmoil on a national scale, the Kerner Commission found that many blacks believed that the police maintain a much less rigorous standard of law enforcement in the ghetto, tolerating illegal activities like drug addiction, prostitution, and street violence that they would not tolerate elsewhere. In Moore's eyes, the issue of marijuana decriminalization was gaining traction because white kids were now using the drug and getting arrested more often. These young whites were the true objects of Clark's legislation, Moore claimed, as people don't want them to get criminal records because they want them to become young judges and lawyers. Moore's hard-eyed skepticism was common among a certain segment of black activists who viewed their self-proclaimed white allies with suspicion. For example, in 1970, the black poet, singer, and activist Gil Scott-Heron had ridiculed white activists such as members of such as members of Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. The irony of it all, of course, is when a pale-faced SDS motherfucker dares look hurt when I don't call him brother and tell him to go find his own revolution. He is fighting for legalized smoke or lower voting age, less lip from his generation gap at home, and fucking in the street. Where is my parallel to that? All I want is a good home for my wife and children and some food to feed them every night. There was, of course, a significant difference between David Clark and the pale-faced SDS motherfucker in Scott Heron's poem. Unlike the self-centered SDS member, Clark advocated for decriminalization explicitly out of concern for black lives. Still, black leaders had experienced enough disappointment to have developed a healthy suspicion of even the most left-leaning white ally. As Stokely Carmichael had once joked, I'm going to tell you what a white liberal is. You talking about a white college kid joining hands with a black man in the ghetto. That college kid is fighting for the right to wear a beard and smoke pot, and we are fighting for our lives. Well, here I am with a beard and like to smoke pot. I'm sure that critique could be leveled at me. Man, this wind. In addition to questioning Clark's motives, Moore claimed that decriminalization would only hinder blacks' attempts to achieve equality. In his eyes, marijuana use was both a symptom of racial oppression. Blacks who used the drug were suffering from the stresses of white racism, and just as important, a cause. Drug users, Moore believed, were in no position to undertake the work of rebuilding their individual lives, let alone that of collectively mobilizing against racism. Again, this belief was prevalent among members of the black left during the 1970s. After 2 Howard University students died from apparent drug overdoses in October 1971, students, professors, and local activists organized a series of anti-drug activities. Black people don't have the time or the resources to waste themselves in a world of distorted reality, said Professor Lovinger Bowden, the head of the university's Speech and Communication Department. At one of the events, we cannot pull ourselves together if we are on cloud 9. In 1979, Maynard Jackson, Atlanta's first black mayor, used the same logic to oppose decriminalization in his city. You cannot lead a movement when the army is asleep. We need nothing that debilitates us, tears us down. We cannot change anything when we do not have weapons in hand, not guns and knives, but your brain and discipline. Stokely Carmichael took the argument one step further, casting drugs as a deliberate attempt by fearful whites to tranquilize black opposition. Fighting against drugs is revolutionary because drugs are a trick of the oppressor, he told an audience of Morehouse College students in 1970. The political consciousness of our people is rising, and in order to dull the political consciousness of our people, the oppressor sends more drugs into the community. If Moore shared Carmichael's conspiratorial suspicions, he didn't say so during the marijuana debate. Still, he agreed that drugs hobbled black Americans. Instead of a community rendered impotent and ignorant by drugs, Moore sought collective action. I want a strong, virile, black thinking population. As at Clark's Judiciary Committee hearings, the witnesses aligned with Moore's point of view spoke passionately about the burdens of drug use and addiction, especially borne by the city's youth. There was an echo of the argument Hassan had adopted in his fight against heroin. No matter how effectively Clark's allies documented the havoc that drug enforcement wreaked on the black community as a whole, young users remained the weak link in their case for reform. After all, nobody was willing to defend the right of adolescents to get high. Don Freeman, on behalf of a group called Community Research, argued that even mild regular use of marijuana during the crucial years of adolescence does represent a potentially serious concern. Paul Quander, an assistant principal at H.D. Woodson High School. asked, "If the city council is the city council going to legislate permissiveness and expect our young children to retain a usefulness in society? Furthermore, in the light of broader racial inequalities, decriminalization looked like another roadblock to black success. White children, Moore noted, had good schools and a lot of opportunities to think. Black children lacked these advantages, and the evils of their situation would only be compounded by drug use." Once again echoing Carmichael and Jackson, Moore declared, "It would seem to me to be a social crime to depenalize marijuana so as to make it possible for more black children who cannot think already to keep them from thinking." Hey. Among those who agreed with Moore, no one offered more significant testimony than Superior Court Judge John Fauntleroy. Like Moore, Fauntleroy was sensitive to the plight of poor and working class blacks. Raised in segregated Washington, D.C., he had graduated from Armstrong Technical High in 1937, where he had trained in printing. Though he was unable to find work in that field, Fauntleroy was resilient and talented, and he eventually landed a clerical job with D.C.'s largest employer, the federal government. Later, he enrolled in night classes at Robert H. Terrell Law School, a program that, despite its brief 19-year lifespan, managed to educate a generation of local black lawyers. In 1967, after 20 years in private practice, Fauntleroy became one of D.C.'s first black judges. He used the bench as a pulpit, arguing for the rehabilitation of juvenile offenders and challenging the keep them out of sight, keep them out of mind attitude that he saw as prevalent in the city. In one high-profile incident, he stirred controversy in D.C.'s legal community by criticizing the city's respected public defender service for failing to hire black lawyers. Charles Ogletree, the renowned Harvard law professor, was a first-year lawyer at PDS at the time. He remembers Fauntleroy as a very conscientious and highly regarded jurist, admired by public defenders and prosecutors alike. Let's see how much we got left. So here we have a barrier-breaking black judge who, like Moore, was outspoken on issues of racial discrimination, particularly in relation to the city's youth. And yet, also like Moore, Fauntleroy was unswayed by Clark's insistence that decriminalizing marijuana would benefit the black community. Instead, he believed that the fragile state of affairs for black teenagers in D.C.'s poor neighborhoods was an argument for prohibition. White teenagers could use marijuana without jeopardizing their futures, Fauntleroy explained. After getting high, they could always return to enjoy the comforts of the suburbs. But poor black teenagers in the inner city had no room for error. Lacking a middle-class cocoon to shield them from the consequences of marijuana use, those who have been born in frustration, who have suffered economic deprivation, who have lived in substandard housing, who may have come from families receiving welfare benefits, who have no automobiles, etc., might never recover from youthful rebellion. Such kids, Fauntleroy concluded despairingly, will have a difficult time securing any job, and having been truants from school, will more or less drop out upon reaching the age of 16. So even if decriminalizing marijuana might save a black adolescent from getting arrested, it is all but guaranteed more serious problems down the line: drug use, school failure, and crime. In his testimony, Fauntleroy even cited a case in which a group of stoned high school students decided to rob their counselor. They broke into his home, beat him and his wife with a pistol, and took their money, television, and stereo. The students were now facing life imprisonment in Fauntleroy's courtroom. If drugs had been less available, the judge suggested, such suffering could have been avoided. Whereas Fauntleroy supplied social arguments against decriminalization, the city's black clergymen added ethical and spiritual imperatives. As head of the committee of 100 ministers, Andrew Fowler was among D.C.'s most powerful religious figures. Fowler opposed Clark's bill because of the harm marijuana caused to the individual user and to the black community as a whole. Marijuana was habituating, Fowler argued, had negative psychological effects, including anxiety and impaired judgment, and it often led to crime. Well, he was wrong on that. Fowler did not cite any research to support these assertions, opting instead to claim authority from the 30-plus years of direct experience as a local pastor. Drawing from Matthew 25, Fowler told the members of the city council that to decriminalize marijuana would be to abandon the city's downtrodden. As a result of marijuana, some people are hungry, some are thirsty, some are strangers, some are naked, some are sick, and some are in prison, he said. The city's poorest souls need deliverance, he argued, and the proposed legislation offered just the opposite, a legalized hell. We urge you to stand in the breach, he said, speaking to the council on behalf of the D.C. Christians. The judgment of God is against us otherwise. In addition to arguing that marijuana was harmful in itself, black pastors insisted that it was a gateway to harder drugs. This was the thrust of testimony by Samuel George Hines, who spoke before the city council on behalf of the 2nd Precinct Clergymen's Association, a group of 30 local ministers. Perhaps Hines and his colleagues had not read Marijuana, a Signal of Misunderstanding, which 3 years earlier had found that marijuana actually was not a gateway drug, or perhaps they had read the report but found its conclusions at odds with their own experiences with drug users. In either case, speaking out of concern for the city's impressionable youth, Hines railed against the argument that marijuana use was innocuous. If such an attitude prevailed, he argued, innocent young people could be lured into harmless fun, and that could lead to deeper drug involvement. The fear that marijuana high might eventually become insufficient, causing the user to seek a more powerful high, was nothing new. Hassan had raised this concern in 1970, arguing that young people who smoke marijuana can be induced to take heroin, since they have been told to try this pill. It will get you high faster and keep you there longer. And drug sellers could be counted on to push ever more serious products. As Fauntleroy emphasized in his testimony, a dealer on the street typically had more than one drug in his inventory. To tempt a marijuana user with harder drugs, including heroin, amphetamines, LSD, angel dust, and other drugs, was simply good business. David Clark and the witnesses who supported decriminalization took great pains to emphasize that they were not promoting marijuana use, but Moore scoffed at these disclaimers, maintaining that the city's young black men whose lives he championed would interpret the city council action differently. I can hear young people quoting the new law all across the city, he declared. They'll be saying, you can have 2 ounces now, blood, because it is legal. This was simply intolerable to Moore, whose views on drugs were straightforward. Black men don't need crutches of marijuana or heroin. Moore was also unmoved by Clark's harm reduction arguments. He didn't want DC's black communities to be places where young people who smoked marijuana had to pay a fine instead of going to jail. He wanted young people not to smoke pot in the first place. He wanted the city's black youth off drugs in school and in the workforce. I have 3 black boys, Moore told Clark's committee. I don't think black folks have any purpose in taking any kind of drugs. You want to read some? Just a second. I'm going to stop this and restart.